Hello, welcome. Today we're going to consider a YouTube video titled Pluto's Not a Planet and Trans Women Are Women. The video was published by a YouTuber many will recognise, Steve Shives. Shives is an atheist vlogger who has produced several video series, and initially his videos debunked conspiracy theories, pseudo-science and assorted woo. However, as many people may be aware, more recently the tone and content of his channel changed from his original focus on religion and pseudoscience, and now he leans towards social justice and feminism. I think it's safe to say that this change in emphasis has attracted sharp criticism from many in the atheist YouTube community. In his video he covers gender-related matters and makes the case that trans women are in fact women, and in support of his opinion he references what he believes to be supporting evidence from biology, genetics and general science. Now the video is 18 minutes long, but don't worry, we won't be going through it point by point, because the first half is simply Shives laying the foundation for his later argument. So we can summarise that part, but later we shall be taking a close look at some of the missteps in reasoning which are quite common when dealing with this particular topic. In the first part of the video, Shive uses the example of the reclassification of Pluto from planet to dwarf planet to highlight the fact that science is tentative by nature. He suggests that this planetary demotion by astronomers indicate that scientific knowledge is subject to change and modification in the light of additional observation or change in theory. In this he is correct, but as the title to his video suggests, he then goes on to make the claim that there has also been a comparable shift in the scientific understanding of sex determination in humans. Now this is another quite separate argument, because while it is true that in the last decades there has been an explosion in our understanding of the genetic mechanisms involved in sex determination, do these advances in knowledge actually support his worldview? Shives claims that it does. I suggest he is wrong. Let's listen to Steve as he makes his main argument.
We all grew up in a world where it was an established scientific fact that Pluto was a planet. Most of us also were taught to take for granted that gender was a binary concept. There were men and there were women, and there were easily discernible factors that determined who belonged in which category. There are several widely known and practiced methods for distinguishing men from women. The most obvious difference between the genders in the minds of most people is our genitalia. As anyone who's seen Kindergarten Cop can tell you, boys have a penis and girls have a vagina. Another way is by the size of the gametes an individual produces. Gametes are the cells that fuse together during fertilization and sexual reproduction. Females produce the larger gametes, which we call ova or eggs, and males produce the smaller gametes, which we call spermatozoa or sperm. And still another way is by sex chromosomes, also called allosomes. The cells of females carry two X allosomes, while the cells of males carry an X and a Y allosome. All three of these methods presume a simple black and white concept of gender that is ultimately rooted in readily observable biological characteristics. You're either a man or you're a woman, and it's easy to tell which is which. Most people regard the gender binary as a fundamental fact of life. It's basic biology. It's one of the first things we learn about ourselves. It's a major influence on how we organize our societies and how we perceive each other. Boy-girl, penis-vagina, sperm-egg, XX, XY. It's familiar, it's comfortable, it's common knowledge, and it's not fully representative of reality.
Well, of course it's not representative of reality, Steve, because your understanding of the biology doesn't match reality. Firstly, Shives conflates gender and sex. What he describes in most part relates to biological sex, but he constantly referred in his description to gender. Sex and gender are not the same thing, and he conflates the two in his argument. This is a common misstep in reasoning. He also confuses dimorphism with dichotomous sex differences. Genitalia, for instance, are dichotomous. That is, one form is present in each sex, but dimorphic difference is a matter of degree. It is simply a difference in shape or structure. When we consider dimorphic differences, we do not include the genitalia, because genitalia are dichotomous, not dimorphic. What Steve has done in this section is carefully detail the differences between the sexes. He listed differences in genitalia, gamete size, and chromosomal or genetic difference. This is not an exhaustive list. Perhaps we could add hormonal differences, as hormonal regulation of the fetus is critical in determining phenotype and drives the later development of secondary sex characteristics and even trait. Some of the differences Steve listed in his explanation are easily observable, such as genitalia, for instance, but some are not readily observable, such as chromosomal or genetic sex. Biological sex itself should be considered as binary. The genetic mechanism involved in sex determination is relatively mechanistic in nature. That's not to say that things don't go wrong, because they do. We can also argue in relation to when sex of the fetus is determined. I would suggest that sex is determined at the time of conception. Others might argue that it is determined at 7 weeks, when the fetus is either masculinized or feminized by gene-directed hormonal regulation. But regardless of when it is determined, biological sex itself can only be considered as binary, and this is true for all mammals where sex is genetically determined by transmission and combination of X and Y chromosomes. This leads us to the first weakness in Steve's argument, because he focuses on the categorization of Pluto, but ignores the fact that the change in definition leaves the other 8 planets still majestically orbiting the Sun, unconcerned and untouched by the controversy over their junior, perhaps inferior member. And this is also true in relation to the biology. Whatever one decides in relation to sex determination, it must not only apply to us as a species, but also needs to apply to other mammals and our closest relatives, the primates. If one argues for an exception for Homo sapiens, if one is to make a case for humankind being unique in this regard, then one needs to provide an extremely convincing body of evidence in support of this position. I would suggest so far Mr. Shives has brought nothing of consequence to the debate. This might change as we progress, so let's continue.
In 1972, Dr. Albert de la Chapelle published a paper in the American Journal of Human Genetics titled Nature and Origin of Males with XX Sex Chromosomes. The paper was a review of data relating to individuals who, for the most part, were typically male, but who carried XX allosomes. Today, this condition is called XX male syndrome, and it occurs in about 1 in 20,000 men. There's a similar condition called XY gonadal dysgenesis, or Swyer syndrome if you prefer, the result of which is women who carry XY allosomes. Swyer syndrome is even less common than XX male syndrome, affecting approximately 1 in 80,000 women. Swyer syndrome also frequently requires more significant medical intervention, as it prevents puberty from occurring naturally. Most individuals with the condition undergo hormone replacement therapy to promote the development of typically female secondary sex characteristics. Both of these conditions are extremely rare. Of the approximately 130 million people born every year around the world, only about 4,000 will have either XX male syndrome or Swyer syndrome. But the prevalence of these conditions isn't the point. The point is, people who have these conditions are still regarded as genuine members of their genders. Men with XX male syndrome are still men. Women with Swyer syndrome are still women. Their existence is evidence that gender isn't always determined by the type of sex chromosomes a person carries. chromosomal sex determination may be a reliable method in general, and the XX equals woman, XY equals man dichotomy might account for the great majority of people, but it doesn't include everyone. And by the way, neither do the boys have a penis, girls have a vagina, or women make eggs, men make sperm dichotomies. Are those statements typically true? Yes. But are they rigid, immutable, universal truths? No. Reality, as it turns out, is a lot more complex than that. It's currently estimated that approximately 1 out of every 250 adults in the United States is transgender. That means their gender identity, their personal, internal experience of their gender, is different than the gender they were assigned at birth.
In this section, Shives references a 1972 paper by Chappell titled Nature and Origins of Males with XX Sex Chromosomes. And here we have a major issue. Is it possible that Shives is being somewhat selective in his presentation? Because if we go back a little further to 1959, we find that Klinefelter syndrome and Turner syndrome were first identified. The karyotypes observed in both Klinefelter's and Turner's confirmed the critical role of both the X and the Y chromosomes in sex determination in humans, because it was observed at the time that all Turners are female and all Klinefelters are male. Also, at the time that particular paper was published, it would have been common to see terms such as hermaphrodite and true hermaphrodite used to describe intersex conditions. These terms, along with many others, are no longer used in the literature. As the title of the paper suggests, understanding of intersex conditions at the time was tentative. Today, we know that gonadal dysgenesis is caused by SRY genes attached to the X chromosomes or one of the autosomes. So, in this example, we have a phenotypic male who carries a 46XX karyotype, but this is because on at least one of the X chromosomes, we will find Y chromosomal material. And this is why we have to be careful in our description of certain genetic conditions. Also, towards the end of this section, having described what is primarily considered disorders of sexual development or intersex conditions, he then changes to the prevalence of transgenderism. Now, this is a problem because while sex and gender are highly correlated, they should be considered as distinct. Are we discussing intersex conditions or are we discussing gender dysphoria? Which is it? Shives moves from one to the other smoothly without pause or consideration, and this leads to confusion. For instance, Shives will later state that gender is assigned by a clinician at birth, but this is obviously incorrect. A clinician will determine sex at birth, and at that stage, sex will be determined by phenotype. Some intersex conditions that affect genital development will be easily detected, but there are many genetic disorders that are not so obvious and may not be detected until adolescence or adulthood. From this point on, Shives descends into the usual SJW gender jihad rhetoric. Gender is a spectrum, sex is a spectrum, it's all good, free unicorns all round. But at this point, we all know that he has confined his scientific curiosity to the bubble of feminist alternative biology. He bemoans those he considered as using out-of-date definitions, while citing a vintage 1970s paper to support his position. At the end of the video, he implies that his worldview is supported by large amounts of evidence, and suggests that we should modify our own understanding of sex and gender to accommodate this new wealth of readily available data. Yet he does not trouble himself to inform us what this data actually is, or where it might be found, although I'm sure we can all guess the source of this nonsense. Before we end our adventure into the SJW Twilight Zone, let's listen to one final fragment of wisdom, because it is quite revealing.
This next point is very important, and it's something that everyone, but most especially cis people like me, who are overwhelmingly in the majority, must understand. When a trans man says, "I'm a man," he isn't pretending to be something he's not. When a trans woman says, "I'm a woman," she's not asking the rest of us to indulge her in a fantasy that she has concocted for herself. When a trans person expresses their gender, they aren't trying to deceive anybody. They are telling us something fundamental about themselves, something that is no less true for them than my gender identity is for me, or any other cis person's gender identity is for them. Just like the concept of a planet, the concept of gender is a construct people came up with in an effort to better understand the world in which we live. Men are men, and women are women because they fit into categories we defined in order to describe how our bodies work, how we interact with each other, how we perceive ourselves to be. For most of the history of our species, the gender binary and the various methods I've been discussing of distinguishing one gender from another seemed adequate to describe those things. But now we know different, whether we want to admit that to ourselves or not. Now we know that gender isn't a binary, it's a spectrum. I haven't mentioned this yet, but some people have a gender identity that falls outside the man-woman either-or dichotomy. They identify as pangender or agender or third gender or gender fluid or something else entirely. The typical concept of gender fails to account for them, and yet they exist. I also haven't drawn a distinction in this video between gender and physiological sex, but if you find such a distinction useful, you might be interested to know, if you don't know already, that physiological sex isn't binary either. It also exists on a spectrum, with typically male people at one end, typically female people at the other, and all sorts of fascinating and wonderful variations in between.
So there we have it. No such thing as binary sex, and therefore no such thing as gender. It's all on a spectrum or social construction, with all sorts of fascinating and wonderful variations in between male and female. The fact that these wonderful variations in karyotype all begin with the term syndrome seems entirely lost in Mr. Shives, even though in his video he listed in part the medical consequences that result from suffering from one of these wonderful variations. Yet now he seems content in ignoring this completely. He also ignores the simple fact that human karyotypes do not come in a wealth of viable alternative configurations. He ignores the fact that gender is factorial, and while it is distinct, it is highly correlated with biological sex, and social construction is only another contributing factor, not the primary driver of gender identity as suggested by Shives. In his video, Shives suggests that the prevalence of intersex might be as high as 1.7%. This statistic should be familiar to regular viewers of this channel. Shives, it seems, subscribes to the ideological biology of Fausto-Sterling. Many viewers may not be aware that the 1.7% figure includes conditions which most clinicians do not recognize as intersex, Klinefelter syndrome, Turner syndrome, and late-onset adrenal hyperplasia. If the term intersex is to retain any meaning at all, its use should be restricted to those conditions in which chromosomal sex is inconsistent with phenotypic sex, or in which the phenotype is not classifiable as either male or female. Applying this more precise clinical definition, the true prevalence of intersex is seen to be around 0.018%, almost 100 times lower than Fausto-Sterling's estimate of 1.7%, which is ideologically motivated nonsense. If you would like a more detailed treatment of this topic, I have a 3-part series titled Sex Ed for SJWs. Part 1 covers sex determination, Part 2 covers variation, and Part 3, called Intersex, provides a comprehensive overview of intersex conditions. Also in the video titled Feminist Science Part 3, Biology, I cover the work of Dr. Fausto-Sterling, who is often cited by feminists and SJWs in relation to the prevalence of intersex conditions, all of which will be linked in the description box below. We end our adventure at this point. I hope you found something of interest in this video. If you would like to support my channel, I now have a Patreon page. If you're unable to support my work through Patreon, then you can share, like, or comment. It's all good. Thank you for watching.